the multiverse. All right, just let's keep it down a little bit because it's obviously this is a screencast, so people that are absent and stuff are going to need to use this in order to get the information. Yes, this is going to be your notes for Lab 7. So make sure you have a piece of paper out and take notes. Okay, so when we first started in programming, right? The difference between learning a foreign language basically and programming is programming's a little bit like, not like learning a foreign language, but more learning to give basic instructions to, say, somebody from another planet who doesn't get any of your references to any other objects. Anything that you tell it to do, you have to define every object that you explain, and you have to know, you have to define terms. Some of those explanations are a little bit more complex. For example, if you tell your alien friend to grab something out of the refrigerator, right? He would have to know that there is a thing called the refrigerator, and it has drawers in it that opens. It makes stuff cold. You put milk there. There's a butter tray, that kind of stuff, right? Again, if you tell him we're going for a ride in the car, he would have to know that there's these things called cars, and the doors open, and the intricacies of the internal combustion engine. You have to put gas in it, that kind of thing. So the concept of an object is exactly that. We're going to define an object that we're then going to later use to produce some sort of information, right? So my favorite example of this, because it kind of works for everything that you have to learn in the beginning, is a user account. So let's say you're a programmer at Facebook or maybe MySpace with our skill level.
Oh, at this
point. No. You're creating a user account, right? So let's just define the class user, right? Everything that goes in this class gets tabbed in, okay? First thing that we're going to define is the constructor, right? So we use def just like we do with every other function. The difference being that we're going to call this one init, and that stands for initialization, right? Well, what we're initializing here is the object itself, or specifically all of the data values that are going to be contained in this object. Okay, so the entire object's worth, every little tiny piece of data and data type that you're going to use in this object is going to be created here. Okay, so the other thing that you need to know about init is that its only job is to build the object. It does nothing else. And in fact, it is going to run once as you create the object. And then once the object is created, init is no longer part of the object. It disappears. Okay? So what kinds of things do user accounts have?
Password.
Yeah, username, password. What else? Email. Let's go ahead. What about IDs? Right? User IDs. Okay. So the way we set this up is these are a completely different set of variables, right? These are what's coming in from the outside. Here we set up our instance variables, and in some programming circles and languages, they'll call these fields. So instance variables and fields are interchangeable terms. It's basically what those are the basic data building blocks. It's the initial information, data, numbers, text values, that kind of thing that you need to build the object in the first place. Okay, so all of what we're pulling in from the outside here, all of our parameters are going to set values on our fields. So we want our user object to contain, right, a user ID. So we'll say self dot user ID equals ID. Okay. And in fact, instead of pulling this from the outside, let's actually replace that with self, since self is our first parameter. We'll get into what, just accept self for right now. Towards the end of this, I promise I'll explain to you what self is. Okay. User ID. Do we want to pull that in from the outside? Or if you're looking at something like Facebook, that would probably be generated randomly, right? We just, let's just say at that random. Yeah, we're going to do that, dude. Relax. Take it easy. What's that? Oh, yeah. Rand int. I'm going back and forth between Java, so everybody relax. And let's just say somewhere between 1,000 and 9999, and that'll give us a nice 4-digit number that we can use for that. All right, so user ID is not coming in from the outside. We're generating it randomly. Username, let's capitalize the name part. And we want to use self dot with everything. User name equals UN. Same thing for the rest of these. Self dot, call this pass equals PW, and then self dot em or email equals em. Okay, you guys with me so far?
Yes.
Okay. Questions on any of that? Okay, so when we build these things, right, we want them to have all this data. But remember what I said, this is all going to disappear as soon as I create a user object, right? So as soon as somebody logs into my Facebook and says, or whatever my website is, right, and they create a user account, this constructor is going to go away. So what's going to happen if, like, say I wanted to change my username, you know, and my account's already been created? What do? What we need is a modifier, right? So def, let's go set values. I use that one a lot, and literally does the exact same thing as the constructor. The only difference is once the object is created, modifier is going to hang out, right? It's still there. So we can actually use this at a later time if I wanted to change my username or password. The other thing that we can do, the reason why you can see in a nutshell just from this, we don't even have to completely write the object for you to see why we're doing this. The number one reason why we use object-oriented structure that's built into any other programming language that you're going to learn, like Java or one of the C languages, is encapsulation. And what it means is some of this data I may not want to change. I want to be able to control what the user is then going to go in and be able to change, right? For example, this user ID. Is it a good idea, once a user sets up an account, is it a good idea for me to allow the user to change their user ID?
No.
No, it is not. So I can control that access just by leaving it out of the modifier, right? Your user ID just got created randomly when you made your user account. Guess what? Nobody has access to it anymore. That is your username forever. Make sense? That's how we control access to our data members. All right. Now, all these guys are now modifiable, right? But I can say, like, if I didn't want somebody to change like their first or last name or something, I could do that too. So these are all of our data members, right? And we're going to do some stuff with them. Number one thing, especially with user accounts, that we want to do is we want to be able to retrieve that information at any given time, right? Def get for everything, right? Get username. Everything has self. Trust me when I tell you, make sure you include self in everything. I promise you that I will go over what self means in a second. Let's just accept that it's there for right now. Okay, so self, how do we get in? How do we send information back out? We return. We've done this before, right? Self UN, or actually it's username. Def get, what should I call that? Get pass. Self return self dot password. Def get email. Self return self dot, what is it? Email. Okay. You guys good with this so far? Okay. So that is a basic object. There's not really much more to it than that. We can do some other stuff, like with your MPH thing. We'd have another function down here that'll make like calculations and stuff based on what information you have up here. But for a simple user account, most of the stuff is we're just storing data and we're reusing it somewhere else, right? We're retrieving it from somewhere else. So basically, we're just setting and getting, right? So let's make our main function. Now, truth be told, when you're using Python, main isn't really that much of an actual thing. However, when you graduate to using other types of object-oriented software, a main function or a main method is your entry point into the software. It's where all the initialization, everything, the start of the program takes place. Okay, so we just make one here, mostly just so it looks like other object-oriented software. Okay, so we have our main here, and it would help if we define it. Okay, and in here I'm going to create some instances of this class. I'm going to create, so we want to think about this class here. Think about it as it's all like the building blocks and a set of instructions. So you just bought a kit, right, to build a user account. It's a digital kit, right? So if I wanted to create a user object, I would just say, let's just call it user1, right, is a user object, right? And that's really all I have to do. The problem is when I run this, oops, I didn't run that in Python. Hold on. Problem is when I run that, if I tried to get any of these values, they'd be null because I didn't give them any yet, right? So what I would want to do probably is set default values, right? So I set default values here. Oops, I don't need a default value for self. Self gets a value inherently. So I set these default values so that all these guys get a reasonable data value, because null returns can cause major errors down the road. So if you create a user account without information in it and you have a bunch of null values and then you try to run other programs using that information, those null values can cause errors. So we want to set default values that make sense. And here I can't really use a 0, can I? That's the string equivalent of 0 is an empty string. So for numerical values, you would use a 0. I use an empty string here. So it's just a default value that's reasonable so that it allows your programs to run without generating errors. So if I ran this and then I started using my getters to print stuff out, it'd be okay. Okay. Now we're going to go over self dot. So self in object-oriented language, the other keyword that you'll use that's similar in Java and C language is the this dot keyword. So this and self are pretty much the same thing that you would see. So if I use, so what the self is it refers to the object that all of this is contained in. So I just created this user1 object, right? So if I refer to self.username on my user1 object, self is user1, right? If I created a second object, user2, self on that object would be user2. So self just refers to the object that you're pointing to at that particular time. That makes sense? And I'll show you how that looks in real terms. Let's give this some data, okay? So without setting up user inputs or anything, I could say username, prof, last name, or password, handsome, right? And my email would be, let's just use my, right? So I got to use, so I got an email. Now I can start, I can use that to basically retrieve the data and start printing stuff out, right? So I can say print user info. And user plus user1 dot get un. All right. So again, user1 takes the place of self there, right? So I'm actually, when I run this, I'm actually getting user1 dot username. Does anybody have questions about what self is at this point? Self is kind of complex, so I really need everybody to do the best they can to let that sink in. User1 is self for the user1 object, okay? I have this object called user1. It has all of this stuff in it because I told it to here, right? I said it was going to be a user object. So it contains all this stuff. And in this context, in the user1 context, self refers to user1. So I can print the username. I can print, what else am I doing? Password. User1 dot get pass. And what else do I have? Get email. And I can add user1 dot get email. Are you guys with me on this one?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so let's see what happens here. What happened? Nothing worked.
Yeah.
Well, I have this lovely function called main, right? I didn't actually run it. Standing in front of the Ferrari, why isn't it going? Didn't turn on the keys and drive it.
Go by.
So I printed all my stuff, right?
Yep.
So here's why. This is all from the constructor, right? I put all this data in, right? That's all from the constructor. Okay. I can now use the modifier on user1. Yes.
Why do we have to do the get using the passive function because it returns the object? Why can't we just call the object? The user1 dot password.
Yeah.
I'd have to do all this work.
So there's a reason why. So let's try that. It actually might work in Python. Actually, I'll print it.
I need to turn off my phone.
Let's go get pass. Oh, because I left that in there. Here, hang on. See if it works. Well, we'll do that. You are going to find, so again, what I was saying from the beginning is that when you're using Python, it doesn't have encapsulation built in as necessarily a part of the of the language itself. We're actually manufacturing it from scratch a little bit. So let's just see. What we want is private access in Python. So you can see there, does it actually, I mean, hopefully his Python is better than his English. Does it exist? I don't know if it's, so private members, but there's nothing in Python to prevent add. Let's see. So there's nothing to actually make it, doesn't appear that there's anything to make it actually private. And honestly, there's probably a way to do it. I haven't gone through it enough to really get into it from that perspective. But the reality is, you'll have, when we graduate to JavaScript, there are private data members inside of your username, right? Or inside of your user class. Like you would, there's a keyword called private in both Java and I believe JavaScript. So you would actually set these to private so that they can't be modified. I'm preparing you for that kind of encapsulation. So even though it doesn't exist right here, we kind of need it here. Okay, so get used to using it this way, and it'll help you when we go to HTML and start using JavaScript and stuff. The key part of this lesson, the first lesson though, 7.0, if you walk away with nothing else, it's that this is my initialization, right? This is when I'm first creating the object. I'm using the constructor here, okay? What I'm doing here, I'm going to set new values. I'm going to use the modifier here. And I can go in here and I can change these to let's go LeBron. And then let's say, let's do not the go at Lakers.com.
Wow.
All right. So I just set all my new data values. And now if I were to print this stuff again, it changes. So if you look at this, right? Let's go down here. I have this bit of information that got printed after I did the constructor here. Okay. Then I modified the data. Then I print the exact same, those are the exact same print statements. You just saw me copy and paste them. Updates with the new information. Questions on that? That's it. That's everything you need to know about lesson 7.0.
Got good notes.
Good.
Still do a cat though.
Cool.
Thanks, Bob.
Final
What a cool